And this video is going to focus on living conditions. So we're going to look at housing, food, water and waste during this period. Okay, so in the first part of the 19th century, so in early 19th century, industrialisation and urbanisation created a public health crisis. Okay, so we've got 5 reasons why it was such a crisis. So towns and cities were growing incredibly quickly. Okay, so this is what this represents. People were moving to towns and cities. The supply of houses could not keep up with demand. So there was too many houses needed and there was not enough houses to actually house people. The town government was really weak. Okay, so a lot of the local governments were weak. There were also not enough laws to ensure decent housing and to protect people's health. So poor quality housing was being built. And another reason why there was a health crisis, okay, is because at this time people did not know that germs caused disease. Just like in the medieval and the early modern period, the theory of miasma continues, okay, and people still don't realise that it's germs that are causing disease. So all of these factors are causing what we call a crisis in public health. So let's look into the different factors then. Let's start with housing. Okay, now it's really important to note that during this period there was a big class divide. So the wealthier were getting wealthier and the poor, unfortunately, were getting poorer, and there was a big difference between housing for wealthy and poor. So we're going to look at the differences there. We're going to start by looking at the housing for the poor. Okay, so all large towns had something called a lodging house while they looked for houses to rent. So when you arrived in a city or a town, this is where you were sent to, something called a lodging house. There were large old houses divided up into smaller rooms. They were absolutely filthy and overcrowded, and people often packed into small rooms. Sometimes you'd even find people having to share beds or to sleep on the floor, and here's an image of what one of those would look like. Okay, so to start off, when you arrive, your housing conditions are really poor. Okay, in these conditions, it's obvious that disease is going to spread quickly. Things like typhus, which I've put here for you to show you the pictures of it. Typhus was passed on by body lice. Okay, so if you're sharing a bed with someone, it's easy to pass on kind of diseases like typhus, which led to pneumonia. Okay, so the best kind of housing a family could hope for was a through house with its own backyard. Many people had to make do with back-to-back housing. Okay, builders in order to pack as many houses in as possible onto a small piece of land, meant they were incredibly cramped. Okay, so as you can see here, back-to-back housing. Some of the very poorest people could not even afford to rent back-to-back housing, so they couldn't afford this type of housing. Instead, they crowded below ground in cellars of other people's houses. Okay, as you can see, back-to-back houses. There's only one room upstairs. They'd crowd within cellars. Okay, which meant that they were very hard to ventilate these houses, especially if you're in a cellar and there's around 10 of you in the room. Look, they were overcrowded. It meant that it led to things like tuberculosis and infections being spread more easily. Okay, this is a picture of what a cellar would look like to live in. And then you compare that to the upper classes. Okay, here he is, nicely dressed. The homes of the middle classes and the upper classes were much better. They were better built, they were larger, they had new gadgets installed such as flushing toilets, gas lighting and inside bathrooms. These houses also were decorated in lavish styles. They could be heavy curtains, flowery wallpaper, carpets and rugs. Okay, so as you can see here, it's a massive, stark difference from a damp basement that might give you pneumonia to quite a plush living space. So that's housing. Housing definitely affected health, okay, particularly if you were poor. It led to things like typhus and pneumonia. Okay, we're going to move on to look at food now then and people's diet. Okay, people's diet, meaning the food that they consume, played a major role in the public health crisis at the start of this period. Okay, industrial workers were cut off from land, which meant it was impossible to grow food in the slums and in the towns and the cities. There's no green areas to grow any crop. Okay, so they were cut off from being able to grow land like they would have been previously in the medieval and the early modern periods. Okay, here when the towns were so overcrowded, there was nowhere to grow food. So let's have a little look at the diet, what would be on the table for a poor person during this period. So the labouring poor, the working class families were forced to buy food from small shops and street sellers because they couldn't grow it themselves. Often they did not have enough money to feed the whole family, so they'd take it in turns to eat. They'd live on things like bread, butter, potatoes and tea. Occasionally, if they were lucky, they might get a cheap piece of bacon. And basically this led to them being malnourished, leaving them prone to disease and sickness. Okay, so the diet really of the poor hasn't changed an awful lot throughout history, from the medieval period to now, but it's almost even worse because they've not got access to fresh fruit and vegetables that they might have had previously. Okay, so it's not only the lack of food in industrial Britain, but the quality of the food, which was also adding to the health crisis. So they're not getting a lot of food, but it's also the quality of the food that they are getting. For the first 100 years of this period, food was preserved in cans. Okay, so the food would be put into cans like this to try and keep it fresh. Refrigerators were not invented almost until the end of this period, so they couldn't chill food. So alongside the government's laissez-faire attitude meant that they did very little to control the production or selling of food until the end of this period. Okay, so although people were being sold food that was inadequate and adulterated, this laissez-faire attitude, okay, which means not to get involved in something where the upper classes were disinterested in what the lower classes were eating. They did not care, essentially. Okay, meaning not much was done about the fact that food was being adulterated. And adulterate means to add things to food that shouldn't be there. Okay, so much of the food eaten by the poor urban workers was adulterated, meaning butchers sold meat from diseased animals. Okay, so they were eating any diseased meat if they could have meat. Things like milk, to make it go further, they were adding chalk to it. Okay, they were adding copper to butter, to make it have like that, to change the colour of it. And obviously you're not supposed to eat things like chalk or meat from diseased animals, so that led to diarrhea and food poisoning. So big crisis around food. Nowhere really to store it to keep it fresh until the end of the period, and really poor quality food. Okay, so we just quickly compare that to their wealthy. Okay, now food was still not regulated for everyone, so sometimes meat was not best preserved, but if you look at the table here, look, they had access to meat and wine, to beef, to goose, to turkey, to spices. Okay, again, their table was much more lavish. Okay, and because they ate more of a variety of food, they could fight off disease better than the lower classes. Okay, so that's food. So we've got a crisis in housing because it's cramped and damp. Okay, we've got a crisis with food because it's been adulterated and it's not being looked after. We're going to look at the crisis in water. Okay, so you've got the wealthy versus the poor, which it wasn't much different really for the wealthy and the poor. So we're going to look at how did they access water. So there was rapid expansion in Britain's towns and cities in the industrial period, and that basically meant that because there were so many people in towns, people needed water, and it put water under pressure, where they were going to get it from and who they were going to get it from. So working class or poor people, as you can see here, they did not have water piped to their homes. So instead, and obviously we need water, they had to get water from pumps in the streets. Okay, so often a whole street had to share one pump, and water was only available for around 2 to 3 hours a day. Okay, they wouldn't pay for, landlords of the houses wouldn't pay for water to be available all of the time. So poor families could not afford water company charges. Okay, so they would be charged for the use of the pump as well. So if you couldn't afford it, you would have to walk a long distance from outside of towns or cities to rivers and streams. Okay, or they would have to collect rainwater in buckets to drink. Okay, so the access to water was really difficult. Okay, so all water supplies in the early 19th century were dirty. So it doesn't matter if you were upper or lower or middle class, okay, all the water was dirty. Middle class and upper class had filtered their drinking water, but this was not an option for poor families. So here's the first kind of filtered water system. Everyone, whether you were rich or poor, had to get their water from pumps, rivers and wells. Okay, if you were wealthy enough, you could send your servant to go and get that water for you. Okay, so in the summer months when the water was the dirtiest, typhoid killed many in the poorest districts. No one was aware that disease was caused by germs in the dirty water. Okay, so they didn't know that they needed to kind of clean the water out and keep waste away from water. And that moves us nicely onto waste. Okay, and this is really important. This was the biggest health problem in the first part of the 19th century. Okay, so the biggest health problem, the existing sewers in towns had been built to drain the streets of rainwater, not carry away human waste. So they didn't really have sewers. They had nowhere for the waste to go. So newly built areas in working class towns barely had any sewers. Also, there was pools of water often filled the streets. There was nowhere for this water to go, so it just kind of hung around on the streets stinking. So people continued to use privies. So not much has changed in terms of the medieval and the early modern period. They're still using privies, which is an outside toilet, okay, that filtered down into a cesspit, okay, or a cesspool, as it's called in this period. Okay, and night soil men, which are gong firmers, would collect it at night and spread it on the field. So really not a lot has changed in hundreds of years. Okay, it was often dumped into rivers still, okay, and there was no sewage systems. Okay, so when landlords did not pay for night soil men to come, so the gong firmers to come, it would spill out into the streets and people's homes, which has been a problem for a while. Okay, a leaking cesspit or pool was close to a well or water pump. If it was close, it meant that basically it was leaking into the water systems. So they were drinking infested water. Okay, so how did the wealthy get rid of their waste? Okay, a lot of them had water closets inside their houses, which were toilets. Okay, many of these were emptied into rivers, again, which is ironic because the waste were emptied into rivers and water companies are getting their water from those rivers. So essentially, the upper and middle class were paying for diluted poo excrement for drinking, cooking and washing. So waste was no better for the health of the upper or the lower class because they'd not managed to work out that that's where the germs were. Okay, quick test then. A few questions, pause the video, see what you've taken in from the video, see what you can remember.